together, shook it all up, and this is what I got. All right? So I take no credit for anything. But I think the outline in the book of Galatians is pretty important because once you see the way Paul is writing this letter and you see the direction he's giving, I think it becomes much more easy to understand this whole process that he's given to us. He's not just dumping doctrine on us. It's doctrine in a very personal way. In Galatians, a lot of times we look at Galatians and Romans and even Hebrews as this very doctrinal letters that tell us strictly this is your theology. You've got to believe in salvation by grace through faith. And that's true, very much true. Galatians and Romans teaches that our salvation is through the grace of God by us putting our faith and no works involved, no keeping the law. But when Paul gives us this, he doesn't just give it to us here as point A, point B, point C. He gives it to us. This is why it's always building on it. We haven't even got to the meat of it. When we get to chapter 3, we're talking about his arguments, the personal argument, the scriptural argument, the logical argument, the historical argument. All these really make it even stronger. So Paul is going to tell you we're saved by grace, and this is how we know we are saved by grace. We've noted already that Paul has this setting that's going on. Paul had gone to Galatia, in that area, established churches in Galatia. He's come back, and he's getting word that those in Galatia are being sucked into a different gospel, if you will, a perverted gospel. And that's why he's writing this letter. He's writing this letter to the churches in Galatia that he had led to Christ, that he had shared grace with them. Man, that's fantastic. There's the map there. Galatia is the northern part there. You see Antioch, the northern Antioch I'm talking about, right at the top of that map there, Galatia. He had gone up in that area, in Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and Perga, and Antioch up there, and shared the gospel. Now he's come back and he's getting word that these people up there have been sort of duped. Those Judaizers have gone up there and said, hey, don't listen to Paul. Paul left something out of the gospel. Paul is saying you're saved by grace, but you've got to keep the law, is what they're telling him. And Paul's writing his letter saying, wait a minute, I've not perverted this gospel at all. This gospel has always been the same gospel, and they're telling you have to add the law to it. The law has nothing to do with keeping getting saved. And so Paul is really correcting this. And we talked about this as we built on that. Chapter 1, the whole idea is sort of expressed in verse number 6. I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Verse 7, this is not even another gospel. Someone has perverted it. And then verse number 8, he says, if anybody has preached, an angel or me or anybody else has preached another gospel besides the one I preached, then I wish them to be accursed. And he says it again in verse number 9 of chapter 1, I wish them to be accursed here. And then the issue was not only were they questioning the gospel Paul was preaching, they were questioning whether Paul was really an apostle. Remember, Paul didn't come out of Jerusalem as an apostle when Jesus rose from the grave. And so they're saying, well, Paul, you adjusted the gospel. Paul, you're really not an apostle. And Paul says, wait a minute, let me give you my history. And then as we go into chapter 1, he gives the history it's particular in verse number 12 of chapter 1. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's the strong point he's saying. I got this gospel from Jesus. I didn't get it from man. Nobody taught it. I didn't learn it from man. I got it from Jesus. And then he gives his own personal story. He says, here's my personal story. You guys know how I was before I got saved. I was keeping the law. I was trying to squash the church, kill the church. As far as touching the law and everything else, I was much more exceeding in this area than you. But the Lord came into my heart and changed my life by his grace. And that's chapter 1. This is the emphasis. And then he says at the end of chapter 1, and I'm telling you, when I got saved, I didn't go run into the apostles. I didn't do that. He said there was a sequence of events that took place. What happened was I got saved in Damascus, and then from Damascus I went out to Arabia. I was there for about 3 years, and I came back to Damascus, and I went down to Jerusalem. I was only there for 2 weeks in Jerusalem. beginning of chapter 2, he says, and 14 years later, then I finally go down to Jerusalem. And this is where it picks up pretty close where we're at. Verse number 1 of chapter 2. Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and I took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. He said, I went there privately and just to show them the gospel I was preached. Now, remember, this is 17 years after he got saved. He's already been preaching the gospel. He's already shared the gospel with the Gentiles. He's already gone all out preaching this gospel. He hasn't verified it with the apostles. He hasn't gone down to the apostles and tell me where I've gone wrong at. 17 years later, 3 years in Arabia and 14 years after that, he comes back in order to make sure that lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. He's not telling them, correct my gospel. He's not telling them. He has no question about whether the gospel is. It is more of a connection with the church in Jerusalem. We preach the same gospel is what he's literally saying here. I went down to Jerusalem to make sure you understand we're preaching that same gospel. It's not a different gospel whatsoever here. And then verse number 6. But he said when I went there with Barnabas, and I went there with Titus. But Titus, remember Titus we said last week, was from a Gentile mom and dad. Titus is one of the Exhibit A. He got saved. And Paul brings him down to Jerusalem. And he said, and when I was down there, they didn't require him to be circumcised. That was a very strong point, because what they were saying is the apostles, they would make you become a Jew before you become a Christian. Paul says, listen, I was there with the apostles, and they didn't make Titus become a Jew. They didn't circumcise Titus. They understood this gospel. And then verse 4, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. And he said, and by the way, we had this liberty that comes from being a Christian. We don't have to keep the law. We're not required in all these legal forms that need to be done. And while we were living in this freedom, people came in to spy it out. In other words, to check it out, see if there's anybody living outside the law. Paul said that they came in, they spied it out, because the reason why is they want to put it back into bondage to the law. Remember today that we have this wonderful freedom of grace. We're not bound by a list of laws that tell you if you don't keep these laws, then you can't be saved. And Paul says this is what they're doing. They were coming in and trying to spy us out to find out where our freedom was so they can put it back in bondage here. Remember that James, I think it's James chapter 2, verse 10, tells us that, and I'll tell you that if I've got it right. I'm pretty sure I got that one right. James chapter 2 and verse 10 says this, for whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. So James says if you can't keep all the law, you're guilty of breaking. If you break it in one place, then you're guilty of all the law. You're guilty of being a lawbreaker. And so what these people wanted to do is take these people that were saved by the grace of God, unmerited, unearned, undeserved love, and put them back under the bondage that nobody could keep anyways. Nobody could keep the law anyways. And Paul says, that he finishes this in verse number 5, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel may continue with you. He said, when these people came in to spy us out, we didn't even listen to them for a moment. We wouldn't let them have any foothold in our body at all. They couldn't come in because we wanted to keep the gospel for you. I like the last part of verse 5. This is where we closed last week. Not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Paul was concerned that the gospel stay pure. Remember, they were charging Paul in the very beginning of not telling the whole gospel. Paul says, wait a minute, it came from God. And he said, and 17 years later, I go back to Jerusalem, and we're going to see how it agrees with the apostles here. But my concern, he says, is to make sure this gospel is still set for you. Last week we talked about Paul's courage, and the only thing we can compare Paul's courage is Paul's conviction. Paul did not want that gospel to change. And This is where we left off last week. We cannot possibly let the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of grace received by faith, not of works, not of keeping the law, we can't let that change. In our generation, we can't let it be altered. It's been given to us. It's ours. It should be something that we're willing to fight for and make a stand for. Verse 6 is where we picked up. I'm going to go from 6 all the way to 10, Lord willing, today in the next 15 minutes. All right, verse 6. But of these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, makes no matter to me. God accepts no man's person. For they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. Now, verse number 6, it's the last part of verse number 6 that I think is the most important part. But leading into that is pretty important here. The King James Version reads one way, and New American Standard, the others read a different way. The King James Version, I just read that, in verse number 6, but of these who seem to be somewhat. The New American Standard reads, but from those who were of high reputation. And he goes on to say, what they were makes no difference to me, and God shows no partiality. Where those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. So what he's saying is these people who had this high reputation, and he said, and by the way, it doesn't matter to me who they are. I like Paul's approach to this whole thing. And then he said, not only does it not matter to me, it doesn't matter to God either. God is not partial to anybody. I don't care if you got the title apostle in your name, it doesn't matter. If you're referred to as one of those apostles, Paul said, that's it. Remember Paul said, I got it from God, and I don't need anybody to come alongside me telling me my gospel is right. But he does say, I went to them privately, and I showed them the gospel that I was preaching, and while people were spying on us and trying to find out where we'd gotten off on this liberty and everything else, he said, when I took it to them, these people were reputation and high reputation, he said, for they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. Now you can circle that at the end of verse 6. Because what he's saying is, when I laid my gospel down to their gospel, and when they looked at my gospel, these apostles that had all this reputation, they could not find anything wrong with my gospel. They didn't come alongside him and say, that gospel's pretty good, but what you need to do is circumcise people. He didn't say, that gospel looks pretty good, but what you need to do is keep the law. He said, when I showed it to the apostles, the one that you hold in high esteem, they added nothing to my gospel. Yes?
Should we associate with people that believe in keeping the law?
Should we
people, Christian groups that hold to the fast.
Okay, so let's see if I understand your question. Should we associate with them, or the question could be, do we agree with their gospel? And I would say the second question, and then I'll come back to the first one you gave. The second question is, no, I don't agree with the gospel, but adding the law to it. All right, because whatsoever is not agrees is based on works and law. Is not the gospel at all. And fact is, see chapter 5, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. Be not entangled again to the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. And we'll get to that probably a year from now when we're trying to get to that. But what he's saying is, if you're requiring circumcision to be saved, then you're not being saved by grace. Your salvation, if you say, I have to be circumcised in order to be saved, then you're saying, I have to rely on the law, and if it's of the law, it's not of grace anymore. And you push the grace of God away. All right, so the first question Tom asked is, can we associate with them? I think we associate people, but the question I think is a bigger question, are they truly saved? Now, I'm going to tell you this is a really hard question because if I asked you, are the Mormons really saved, you say definitely not. If I asked you if Jehovah's Witnesses are saved, you say definitely not, they don't have the same Christ. The Mormons don't have the same gospel. But if I go ahead, step back one more step and say, how about the Seventh-day Adventists? Are they really saved? I think that's probably what you were meaning, don't you? All right? All right? And here's the question. I can't tell you this for sure. If they're relying on the law to be saved, now I've talked to some Seventh-day Adventists who tell me they don't rely on the law, it's all by grace, but they want to keep the law anyways. If the law is required for their salvation, then they are not relying on grace for salvation, and I would question their salvation.
Well, it's like I exercise, but I only do it 6 days a week. I don't do it on the 7th, not because that's a Sabbath, but I think God has one day of rest for everybody.
Yeah.
So I think it's smart to rest one day a week.
Yeah.
But I don't do it because I think it's the religion.
Yeah, you don't do it in order to be saved.
Yeah.
All right? And so there are things that, like people say, well, I don't eat certain kinds of meat. Well, if that's built on your salvation, that says, I'm not saved unless I don't eat these meat, then I think you have problems. Grace is not salvation I experience now. Now it becomes something related to work. That's what he says. There's nothing wrong with being circumcised. He said, behold, I say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. He's not saying if anybody gets circumcised. What he's saying is if your circumcision is what you're relying upon for your salvation, then Christ doesn't profit you on this one. You're building on a law. And so actually Tom's question was a very good question because it's reality around us. And I think if we're talking about Seventh-day Adventists, we're pretty close in a lot of areas, a whole lot of areas. The very nature of Jesus Christ we're really close on and everything. But if they take that one more step and say, I can't be saved without the keeping of the law, then we have to back off and say, no, it's grace. It's got to be grace, purely by grace, and nothing else. I like the way Tom gave that example here. On the Sabbath day, one day of rest, in your case it's probably not on Saturday, it's probably on Sunday, I choose not to it because I want a day of rest and I want a day of worshiping the Lord. Now Tom is not saying that's how I get saved. He's not saying that's required of me in order for me to be saved. What he's saying is, I would like this as an act of worship. In fact, if you go back in the very beginning of the law, there is a day of rest that he gave. And that day of rest was supposed to be for worshiping the Lord. So I think that's fantastic to do that here. But it's not a requirement for salvation. And I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Bill?
I think that's a very good point. I think, though, to be sure about it, that Paul also said, though, that he said that he said we don't do away with the law. I mean, Christ came to fulfill the law, and so I think it boils down to the principle that salvation is not based on the law is based on salvation. I mean, you don't do it for your salvation, like you said, by grace. But at the same time, the law is good. I mean, as Paul talked about, I think in Romans, I mean, and so it's not that it's a bad thing. We need to remember that the law is a minimum standard. In reality, as Christians, we should live above the law.
The trouble is they believe in the law, but they don't keep the whole law. They just keep selected parts of the law.
Yeah, that's why if you talk with a lot of the Seventh-day Adventists, they will tell you that my salvation is not built on that. But I believe that a lot of them will say that the law is a standard that God has showed us where his heart is. He wants us to have a day set aside apart. I mean, not so much the dietary laws, but they'll use the dietary laws too. God had purpose for this, and therefore I'm going to do it. But the minute they cross the lines that my salvation relies upon that, then I have to go back to Galatians chapter 5 and say, then the grace of God is of no use to you. You've thrown away the grace and you depended on the law. And it's certainly not, we wouldn't agree with that at all.
There's hundreds of different laws, and so who can keep them all? Like, for example, on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to build a fire. So how many of us start a car to drive to church with there's a spark plug that starts a fire? You're not supposed to walk or travel so much distance on the Sabbath either. How many of us travel further to go to church? So, or to worship. So, none of us keep the law.
Right, and I think Paul makes it very clear that the law, there's nothing wrong with the law. 7:12. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. All right, so we're not saying the law is horrible, but we couldn't keep it. And it was teaching us that we couldn't keep it, that we need the salvation by grace. And Romans chapter 8, the very next chapter, says this, for what the law could not do it, in that it was weak throughout the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. What the law couldn't do, it was just revealed that we were failures. The Holy Spirit comes in and gives us the ability to live out the life that's pleasing to God here. To me, every time I look at the salvational plan that God has, like the book of Romans, I stand and marvel at it. Because I think, wow, God didn't just take care of this problem, he took care of that problem, took care of this problem. Everything fits together so wonderfully, like this neat puzzle that God put together, this wonderful plan of salvation, that the more I learn of it, the more I'm saying, wow, you couldn't improve on that at all.
The verse comes to mind, love covers a multitude of sins. So we're all sinners saved by grace. And, if I step on your toes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that, it makes no difference that God shows no favor to me.
Right. But if you go back to the law and say that's where my salvation is, then you're doing the same problem the Jews made. The Jews said that in that Roman 9 passage, this is why the Jewish people were having struggle with that, because in Romans chapter 9, it says, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles which follow not after righteousness have obtained the righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, has not obtained the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Why did it happen? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. And he said, for they stumbled at the stumbling stone. All right? So the Jews had a problem. They thought we could keep the law, we would be saved. And the Gentiles were getting saved by putting their faith in Jesus. And he said, well, what was the problem? Because the Jews refused to do that. They stumbled on Jesus. They had a great problem with Jesus saving them by faith. And instead, they stuck with the law to try and improve
Now, when
themselves.
they added all this stuff to the law, to put a fence around the law, so they wouldn't violate the law, so they had to do all these crazy things like, taking the elevator on Sunday here in Israel, crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, if you've been to Jerusalem in a hotel on Sunday, all the buttons are on the elevator are already pushed. You get down the elevator and every door will open because they don't want you to push a button.
Oh.
All right, you can't push a button on it.
Get in their groups. I figured that.
Well, you could, but you can't push a button.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it just shows you the legalism. There's an end to legalism, and that's why we're saved by grace here. But go back to that verse 6, the last part of that verse 6. For they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. That's the key thing, that he's been preaching the gospel for 17 years, and Paul is not saying boldly that I got it right and they got it wrong. He's just simply saying, when we compared their gospel and our gospel, they didn't add anything. My gospel was received by Christ, and it's the same gospel, the gospel of grace here. And that's why he adds verse number 7 here, to it here. But contrariwise, I should say, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. Now, when you read verse 7 in the King James, it's a little hard to understand, because what it appears to be is that Paul is saying, I have a gospel that goes to the Gentiles, and Peter has a gospel that goes to the Jews. And it almost sounds like in the King James Version, he's talking about two different gospels. But he's not saying that at all. Let me read verse 7 from the New American Standard. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. We've been trusted with the same gospel, but Peter was entrusted to give it to the circumcised, and I was entrusted to give it to the uncircumcised. It's the same gospel, he says. And that's why he starts on verse number 7 the King James, but contrariwise, the New American Standard says, but on the contrary, same with the NIV says, but on the contrary, it says I want you to know they didn't add anything, on just the opposite. They just joined So remember I said at the very beginning, Paul is fighting a battle that we don't even know about sometimes either. He's answering issues that we can only read about, try to read into it. We know the issue of the gospel because he's already mentioned that. But the other issue is this idea about whether Paul is an apostle or not, whether he can be trusted or not. And Paul says, we prayed together, we compared, those guys that you have a high reputation, those apostles there, we compared it, they didn't add anything, they simply said, oh yeah, you have the gospel, we have the gospel, you go into the Gentiles, we'll go with the Jews in this. That's exactly what he's saying here, same gospel here. And I think all of us realize that when we reduce it down, it can't be any more simpler than what God gave it to us. For by grace are you saved through faith. It is not through faith. It is not a works. Lest any man should boast. I missed something there. It is a gift of God. Here it is. It is a gift of God, not a works like any man should boast. Here. And I think that's reducing it down. It's God's grace. We receive it by faith. It's a gift God gave it to us. We can't work to earn it. Because if we could, we'd be boasting about how great we are. I mean, that verse is such a wonderful, simple, easy statement about the truth that Paul said. And he said, and when we compared it, it was the same one. They didn't add anything to it. They sent us out with their hand. In fact, a few minutes here, he's going to say, with the right hand of fellowship. They said, no, you go to it. We're in agreement. We're in partnership. We got the right hand of fellowship here. All right? In fact, I'll read on verse number 8. For he that wrought effectively in Peter the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. King James has that in parentheses. And what he's saying is, the same gospel is going out, and the same God is behind that gospel. The one who gave me the power, gave Peter the power, has given me the power also. So it's the same gospel, the same power behind it. We're just going to different groups. At this particular moment here. Now that doesn't mean that Paul is saying, I can't go to the Jews, because Paul loved the Jewish people. You read it in Romans chapter 9, he wished himself accursed. He said, will it be accursed if my people could be saved? It doesn't mean that Peter is not going to speak to the Gentiles. It just simply means God has called specifically Paul to the Gentiles and specifically Peter to the Jews. We know Peter was the first one to lead the Gentiles to Christ that we have record of the apostles in Acts chapter 10. So all this sort of gives us, isn't it rain? Liquid sunshine. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, it'll change. All right. So when you look at this, you begin to see how Paul is handling this argument. He's talked about his own personal change, how God saved him by grace. How it changed his life, how he shared the gospel, how he got it from the Lord and didn't change it anything, and then he went back and literally was being reaffirmed, making sure that the other apostles were behind Peter. Paul had no question about his gospel, but were behind this preaching of the gospel and continue to preach the gospel. All of this just points to this wonderful idea that you and I are just in this long line of gospel spreaders. All of us have the same calling, the same message, the same Holy Spirit, and the same mission. All right? All that's the same. So we have the same mission, the same message, that gospel here. And God's given us his power and his ministry, and he's called us to go out there and share that gospel. We don't have to wonder, is it the right gospel? Because it's already been reaffirmed. It's already biblically sound and solid. We have that message that changes lives. I told you to start with, a couple weeks ago, when you started this section, I said, the wonderful thing about it is when I go to somebody and I have a chance to share the gospel, I don't have to adapt it to them. I might adapt the means in which I share it, but not the message. The message is free, wonderful grace. I told you that when I talked about Kelly Gregory, I just read John 3:16. It's the grace of God that saves you. And that's a simple message, the same simple message that Jesus gave, that Paul gave, that Peter gave, that we have the privilege of giving. The same one that saved back then, saving today. All right? That's the message. That's what Paul wants us to fully understand here. I'm going to stop at verse number 9, so we didn't get to 10. All right? Anybody have any comments? brand new audience.
Yeah, brand new audience,
Yeah.
right? Like if you go to another country and they've never heard the gospel before, it's like a brand new audience.
I love the words you used. It was radical. It was so radical that you have to say, how in the world did Paul preach such a radical message to Gentiles? It has to be described as it was a revelation from Christ. And he brought it because Christ told him to bring it. Otherwise, that's what he was telling you. You know how I was. I was trying to squash the church. I was trying to destroy the church. You know how I was. I was keeping the law and everything else. Well, how do you describe Paul's change? It was a radical change by Christ. How do you describe Paul, who hated the Gentiles? All of a sudden he's preaching the message to the Gentiles. And it has to be Christ who did that. There's no other explanation. That's the argument Paul was making to these people. I didn't come up with this. I wouldn't have never come up with this. There's no way possible I would have came up with such a message to the Gentiles. Christ came up with it.
But it was radical, but in another way, God always had a heart for the Gentiles. And he originally, in the book of Isaiah, talks about Israel being a light and glory to the nations, and yet that they never fulfilled that. And that's why Paul Romans said that God left to make the Jews jealous.
Yeah.
And went to the Gentiles.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a great reminder that God's not surprised by Paul going out to the Gentiles. He had already predicted the Gentiles would be reached way back in the book of Isaiah. Actually, before that, the world should be blessed. Way before that. I think it's unique for us. We're catching up that God's already been ahead of us already.
But we have to remember that God is not through with the Jews. I mean, he set them aside for a while to work with the church. But at the end of time, he's coming back to the Jews.
I believe he's not through with the Jews. I personally believe their promises have to be fulfilled now. But isn't it wonderful that I know that the sequence of connection that we have to Paul, generation after generation after generation, we can trace it all the way back to Paul and to Jesus, the same gospel message that's worth fighting for. It really is.
Two distinctions. There's the church and there's Israel. And people try to say that the church superseded Israel, and that's not true. God worked with the church, and he's still working with Israel.
I think his promises are set to be fulfilled. Yes.
I tend to disagree with all that. I'd say those are different.
I agree. All right.
You said that dog doesn't hunt, is that what you said?
No, it's the
I didn't hear what he said.
He said he would disagree with the Israel part. He thinks it's fulfilled. The Israel part would be fulfilled. And I think he said we'll get to it another time. I know where Don stands on that issue altogether. All right, 7:22. It's raining. Go out and enjoy the rain. All right. And that's the optimistic approach. I now don't have to water my garden. God is so good. All right. Let's suppose we're ready to count. Yeah, I think it's a couple more weeks. Yeah, be praying for Catherine Green. She does have surgery coming up. And this is a surgery she has literally waited for a year to get. And now she's really getting nervous about it, I think. So be praying for Catherine, too. This will be a blessing for her too. And let me ask you to do one more thing besides the business meeting tomorrow. If you know anybody that may be fixing a meal for us as for the service of Connie on Saturday, another word we put out and stuff, make sure you call them up and let them know. Otherwise, they're going to be coming here with meals, and I'll have to eat them. All right. So we canceled the potluck for that reason. Now it's too late to institute the potluck now. All right. So let them know. I literally called. I notified Eileen Rogers because she was here Sunday, and she texted me back and she said thank you. She said I was coming. We're going to come up and swim to be here. So there might be others that need to know that. All right. All right. Let's close with a word of prayer here. Jerry, since you were so talkative today, I'm going to ask you to
salvation that we enjoy is simply a gift from you. We don't have to earn it. We can't earn it. And I'm reminded of the verse, I think it's in Corinthians, where Paul says that we should not be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. So help us in that, Lord. Keep us on the straight and narrow, not so that we can be proud of ourselves, but so that we can demonstrate how gracious you've been to us.